Sex trafficking is real in Hawaii, just as it is elsewhere in the country. Studies show that it is a multi-million-dollar industry that uses the internet and the street trade to exploit women. One study says that Hawaii law enforcement has been ineffective in addressing the problem and even complicit in keeping it alive, and that Native Hawaiian women are overrepresented. Is there a solution? Where do we start? Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Yunji Denise. Tonight is the first of two programs to discuss sex trafficking in Hawaii. In the next hour, we will focus on adult victims. In 2 weeks, the conversation will shift to the sex trafficking of minors. A key finding of a study on sex trafficking in the islands released earlier this year was that although trafficking is real, there was not a lot of data from which to draw conclusions. More information is needed. The study says Hawaii was the last state in the country to pass laws addressing human trafficking. Tonight, our guests present different perspectives on this issue, including a prosecuting attorney, an advocate for legalizing prostitution, a survivor of sex trafficking, and a counselor who helps people who are victims of sexual exploitation. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email, call, or tweet your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and on the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. Lynn Costales is the acting First Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for the City and County of Honolulu. She actively prosecutes sex trafficking cases involving minor and adult victims. Veronica Lamb is part of the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program at the Susanna Wesley Community Center. Her duties include responding to crisis calls, providing consultation to law enforcement, service providers, and the community on working with trafficking survivors. Tracey Ryan is the Executive Director of the Harm Reduction Center. She has been an advocate for trans women and sex workers for more than 2 decades. And Tambi Batanga is a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation and is now an advocate for victims. She organizes community awareness events and offers peer support to sex trafficked survivors. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is such an important issue. Lynn, I want to start with you. Tell us about the difference between sex trafficking and prostitution in the eyes of the law.
So under the law, sex trafficking has a lot to do with coercion, force, threats of force, and it can also involve the commercial sexual exploitation of those under the age of 18, and that's sex trafficking. There is a coercive element to it, and there's an age element to it. You can have both, or you can have one or the other, and that is what sex trafficking is. And I think everybody knows what the prostitution laws are. And that is very different than obviously the coercive element in sex trafficking or the age limitation in sex trafficking.
Veronica, tell me about the people who you're helping. What is the profile of women who are seeking assistance from your organization?
Well, we really see a variety of victims that come through, and so we help both international and domestic victims, and so they can be foreign-born or they can be born in the United States. A lot of the sex trafficking victims that we've worked with have been actual local girls. So whether they are minors or whether they are adults, that's what many of them have been. We have quite a few women or even young girls that were from the mainland, and then we have a few international in there also.
Tracey rather, tell us a little bit about this idea of choice. Can prostitution be a choice?
Of course. Sometimes it's not a good choice, but when I talk to people who work in prostitution and ask them, why would you do this? I mean, the answer usually comes back the same thing. It's for the money. And despite dangers and hazards and the fact that there are people out there who can do horrible things to you, for a lot of people working in the sex industry, the appeal of the large amounts of money they can make in a relatively short amount of time, we don't call it easy work, but we do say the money comes quickly, can be very enticing. And people who work in this over a long period of time, and most of the people I know are transgender women, that's where most of my experience is. It's very hard, even after you've left prostitution officially and you've gone to your straight job, to resist the phone call that comes from somebody who was a regular that you saw for years, who says he wants to come over and he has $500. It's hard to say no to that, and a lot of people don't. And so when we talk about all the people who are doing prostitution in Hawaii, a lot of them are just so invisible that we don't even know who they are, what they're doing, because they're just working off this small group of people.
Tell us about your experience with that, the idea that it is hard to stop going back.
Sure. So originally I was trafficked by a pimp. I was under pimp control for 5 months, 5 long months or short months, however you want to look at it. And then I got away, got out of that, and did it for about another month by myself.
And you were a minor, right?
I was a minor, so I was 15 years old when I originally got into prostitution, and they called it prostitution, and it was in the late 70s. And then I went back out when I was 19, trying to raise my son. At the time, he was 2 years old, and so I went back out in Waikiki. And during the time when I was 15, I did go to the mainland and work in a gentleman's club or a, escort service, what you want to call it. And then I went back out again, like I said, when I was 19, because I was having a hard time financially raising my son, and I had left my abusive boyfriend at the time, who was my son's dad. And so my thing was, I know how to do this, I'm gonna go do it. And I didn't have a pimp at that time. And I did have a boyfriend, and we used a lot of drugs, a lot of cocaine. We were doing a lot of cocaine. I was smoking it at the time. And so I was supporting us in that. And then I got away from it again, and I went and had relationships, and I was straight, and I was square, and I was working in a law office in downtown. And then I left the islands for a bit and came back. And when I came back, I was still having a hard time financially, but I was 34 years old, and I went back out one more time. And I prostituted myself out of a strip bar. And that's kind of how it went for me. Psychologically, you think that you have it together and it's easy to get that money, but it was really dangerous, and I went through a lot of things during the time that I was out there doing that. And there was a lot of scary times and dangerous times that I was going through, and my life was threatened numerous times, and I was raped numerous times, even though they were paying for it. It didn't make it any better for me if they gave me money and choked me out, or if they gave me money and then took the money back. It was still violent, and so it was dangerous.
Can I just say something
Please.
real quick? I mean, so Tammy, I just want to say that it's just, courageous for you to even tell your story, in this forum and any other forum. But I think that is very indicative of, just what it takes to come forward as a victim. I mean, it is not an easy thing. So for her to sit here and to tell her story, I have so much admiration for that, because that is just amazing.
I gotta say, I was very resistant. Like, I worked in this movement for 2 years before I ever came forward. I said to Jessica, I will help you folks. I'll do whatever. It's a startup nonprofit, but I'm not telling my story, and you can't tell my story either. And she respected that, because I've worked with Lynn and Vern for a long time, and they didn't know my story. We were working the same things, and then coming out and actually telling my story. There's a lot of shame to it, but at the same time, I had to realize that I am not, because of what happened to me, that doesn't define who I am today. And I've been out for 20 years now, but I still go through some hard things. Like, I still struggle with different things at times, but it's important, for me as as somebody who came out of it okay, like not everybody can come out okay.
Well, I think we all echo, you know, Lynn.
The shame thing is important.
Yeah.
And one of the shame and the stigma are a real problem for everyone who's worked in prostitution, no matter what their story is. And the saddest part of it is that there is, for the people who've had the least problems in prostitution, they have the most shame. It's stupid. So, you know, if somebody says, well, I was forced, well, then it's a shame, you know, you're now okay. But if you admit, like, you know, you went back to it because you needed the money, or you did this, you did that, or people say, I enjoyed this particular situation I was in, then the shame goes up and escalates. Because then you're saying, well, why are you doing this horrible thing? Well, you know, for the people I know who've been out there for years, and one of my best friends was out in Chinatown for 22 years. It's a long time. And bad stuff happened to her out there. I mean, she was raped 4 times, and she was shot at with a shotgun once, which are all bad. But she also went to prison 6 times. But when I asked her, when I got into this, what can I do to make your life easier? It was all, get the cops off my back. I can take care of myself. And every time she had those violent things happen to her, she never reported it, because she never thought she had a friend she could talk to in law enforcement.
Well, I would love it if you would speak to that. What is law enforcement's perspective on this? How do we help these women without having them be afraid like that?
Well, I think it's, you know, the focus has kind of shifted. I mean, law enforcement is still law enforcement. They are still there trying to enforce the laws, you know, whether you agree with them or not. But I will say that, you know, law enforcement does have a different perspective. Now that we become more educated about the dynamics of sex trafficking, we are more aware of the importance of victim advocacy, about getting services to them, about, you know, lending a hand and doing what we can to assist for those who want to get out. We recognize that some of them do not want to get out, or at least that's what it appears to be on the front end, and that's okay too. But I think law enforcement has gotten a lot more friendly towards the other side of sex trafficking. It's no longer just, you know, let's just lock up people. It is now, you know, let's see what we can do to try to provide some assistance. And so we partner with these agencies that are not law enforcement, but their jobs are really to do services, provide advocacy, get them help, you know, whether that's housing, whether that's medical, whether that's counseling. So we recognize that those parts are very important. And so they kind of have to work hand in hand now. So it is a different shift. Maybe it was a long time coming. But that's certainly where the shift has become. And could we get better at it? Absolutely. But we are definitely on that track of providing more services. And so many of these agencies partner with us as we do law enforcement operations and other things that are happening.
When a woman is referred to you, what kind of services do you give? How do you help them make that transition out?
We have a lot of services, and we really try and meet the individual like where they are and understand that every person is unique in their story that they're coming out of and what they need support with. So yeah, we can assist with housing, all the basic needs, like what somebody needs. We can help with that. If they're minors, then we lean some on child welfare because they have to take that lead role with minors if the parents aren't involved. But yeah, full array of basic needs, counseling, support groups, even for, like, say, the kids, sometimes the parents really need groups to really understand what's been going on and to not blame the child so much, but understand more of the dynamics of what goes on in sex trafficking. We have individual therapy, group therapy. We refer out to all the medical services, just really try and connect them with service providers who truly are trauma informed, and then if they're interested in moving forward with a case and seeking out justice for themselves, then we connect them with the law enforcement that we know, that we trust, that we know has a heart for the issue, and really cares to hear about the victim's story and help them pursue that justice for themselves.
One of the things that makes this show unique, of course, is that we get the viewer questions, and they are starting to come in. We welcome you, of course, to tweet, to call, right on Facebook. We're looking at all of that right now. John in Waikiki says, for an older man who is abandoned by his wife, why not make prostitution legal? The idea of legalizing this, how would that change things?
Well, it depends on what the model is. There are a lot of different models of how prostitution is regulated. And the big controversy now among people who are concerned about what's happening to people in prostitution is whether they are in favor of what's called a Nordic model, which sex workers are against, or they're in favor of a New Zealand model, which is what sex workers are in for. And in both those things, there's a significant change in the way that statutes are drafted in terms of how they're looking at prostitution. Of course, there are other models. There's models which we've had in Hawaii, where we had a regulated brothel system until 1944 here in territorial days, which many people are familiar with. And in Nevada and elsewhere, they have these brothels. The New Zealand model is the one that sex workers want, because sex workers had a collective in New Zealand which was very active and had been for years fighting AIDS. And they came to the table with the legislators and they hammered out something they thought was the best thing for them. And I don't know all about New Zealand, but according to the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, their report from 2017 says they can't find any evidence of sex trafficking in the entire country. And that's 4.5 million people, triple the size of Hawaii. So whether people are ready to jump on board with what New Zealand's done or what I'm advocating or not, the fact that it's so hard to even get that into the conversation is very problematic. I personally feel that most of our prostitution laws, there's not a prostitution law, there's a series. It's the 712-1200 through 1209-6. There's about 11 or 12 of them. And most of them really don't seem to have any real utility. Some of them are duplicative. A lot of them were put in because some politician wanted to do something or another. Some were recommended by people who had no real concept or concern as to how they would play out in reality. And I think we really need to have a fundamental review of the statutes. And then when we can do that, we'll tie that in with a fundamental review of how we're coordinating with social services to address whatever the needs are of the person. Like she was saying, the needs of the person are not always what you feel your agency wants to provide. You've got to listen to that person and work with them, because without their buy-in to whatever you're doing, you're really going to have a lot of trouble getting where you're going. They've got to buy into it.
Tammy, what's your take on legalization or decriminalization?
So I think that it's very controversial, of course, right? So I think that sex trafficking, if there's sex trafficking, that's a no-brainer. If you have somebody who's forcing you, fraudulently leading you into this lifestyle, you know, there's a no-brainer to that. I think that providing a way out, if somebody is in that lifestyle and they want a way out, that should be provided, that we should have service providers and be able to help them, looking at them as a victim and get a way out. As far as legalization, I don't feel that is going to be helpful, because when you have legalization, how do you differentiate and how do you say, okay, if it's legal to buy a human and do what you want with that human, sexually or non-sexually, right? So you can buy a human, I'm gonna pay for you. I'm gonna give you $100, and legally, I am buying you for 1 hour for $100, or $1,000, or $50,000. So do I have now a legal right to do whatever I want with your body for 1 hour?
I mean, I think the question also is, if it were decriminalized or legal when you were in that system, would that have changed anything for you? Would it have been easier for you to transition out, do you think?
I don't think it would have been easier for me to transition out. I think that it would have given buyers a lot more rights to my body.
How?
Because now...
You know you can't enforce a service contract in this country.
Now I can't say, well, I don't want them to do that to my body. They're saying, but I paid for you.
You have the money back.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's get to some more questions.
It's not complicated. You're not buying and selling human beings. You're buying and selling services the human being agrees to perform, just like if you go to a barber shop and they agree to cut your hair. And when a man says he wants to give a woman money for sex, then what he's saying is, I want you to do the sex the way I want it to be, and I don't care about how you feel, but if it's a free system, you always have the right to say no, even after you've taken the money. And if he becomes abusive, in a legal system, you're far more likely to have easy recourse to report what he's doing. So I understand what you're saying, because what you're saying would be horrible. But that's not the concept that we're talking about when we're talking about decriminalization. And we certainly agree that people who are engaging in force and these other things, or people who are engaged, doing things with children are still going to be criminalized.
My question is still going to be, how do we regulate that?
Well, Lynn, let's turn that to you.
I mean, I think that's basically that's kind of the crux of it. I mean, there's a school of thought that says, we should just legalize and it's free agency, but it's a very dangerous, area. And how do you protect that person from, a buyer that wants to do what they will? And that becomes a very dangerous situation. I mean, I think that's where there's a lot of concern, and that decriminalizing it is not necessarily going to keep them any safer than they are now. I mean, it is a very dangerous lifestyle.
It's definitely a dangerous lifestyle, but so is a lot of other jobs which we wouldn't prohibit women from doing, like serving in active duty in the military. And in terms of, saying, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that men will stop abusing people they've hired for sex. Yes, that's true. But a whole lot of other things which are harmful to people in the sex industry will disappear, particularly the chance of being arrested, the thing that not being able to find enough business to keep you going because people are arresting the men who are coming to you. A whole lot of other things would be solved. Yeah. So no, there's no utopia. Yeah, it's not an option.
I think
there's problems everywhere.
I think we can agree that a partial decrim might work. I'm just throwing that on the table just because I know that in some places that has worked, a partial decrim. I think 100% decriminalization that may not work here in our islands. But I think if we look at other states that have a partial decrim and it's working in their state, then we might be able to have that conversation.
See, I would disagree with that, though, because I don't think that we've seen sex trafficking disappear from Nevada just because they've legalized prostitution in areas outside of Las Vegas. Like, Nevada and Las Vegas is still known for the place to go, and they've still got plenty of kids and plenty of adults and plenty of situations that are happening. And even with New Zealand, like, I don't know that much about New Zealand, but as recently as this year, I've met a victim who was sex trafficked, and there was forced fraud and coercion when she was in New Zealand. And, people that she was concerned about and that she was afraid of. So we can't say that legalizing it is going to prevent trafficking or that you won't be able to find it, because that just hasn't been the case that we've seen really in anywhere in the world.
There's no utopian solution. And we in Harm Reduction, and by the way, my organization is Harm Reduction Hawaii, not Harm Reduction Center. That's somebody else. I'm Harm Reduction Hawaii. We in Harm Reduction, we're saying, well, what are the things we can do to reduce the harms? And a lot of the harms we see come from the current statutes and the criminal justice system. Those are things which we have much more power to do something about than necessarily find and stop everyone who's ever been going to be a trafficker, which has not been possible in any place.
Well, I doubt we'll find a resolution to this on the panel tonight, but I do want to move on to some more questions. Richard writing in, sex tourism is a huge part of Honolulu's economy. There are many blatant local quote-unquote massage parlors. How do massage parlors get their workers? In the news recently, there has been what is perceived to be a pretty big crackdown on a lot of these massage parlors. Tell us about that, and where are these women coming from?
Well, the women that we typically encounter are foreign. They're not domestic workers, although some massage parlors do have domestic workers. And when I say domestic, I'm talking about women that are from the United States that are working there. That certainly is part of it, but a majority of them are not from the United States. They are coming from different countries. How are they getting here? We're still trying to figure that out. We have definitely found some situations where they are being flown in, either typically they don't fly straight into Hawaii. A lot of times they fly to the mainland somewhere, or they're brought into the country under some other pretense, and they eventually end up here in Hawaii. So that's kind of what we're seeing currently. But yes, there is a definite effort to try to crack down on that and try to address that. And a lot of the public, they have some concerns, like Richard, that these massage parlors are running rapid.
Right. Well, and the other part of his question is the idea that it's tourism driven. How many of the Johns or what have you of the customers are tourists, and how many are folks that are?
I don't think we actually have data on whether they're tourists, whether they're here through the military, and here on being transferred here through military services, or they're tourists, or they're locals. I think there is a mixed array of all kinds of customers.
Well, Tammy, who were your customers?
So when I did street walking, when I was out, so are we talking about Alaska? In Alaska?
No, here in Hawaii.
So in Hawaii, majority of my customers, because I was a street walker, I didn't do escort service in call. There was no back page. So I was strictly a street walker. So my dates came off of the backside of Hotel Street, or Hotel Street itself, when there was Swing Club and Hubba Hubba and the Glades, and that's where I picked up my dates, and they were locals, they were military. If I worked in Waikiki, those were tourists and military. But if they were locals, they would be down Hotel Street side. But yeah, a lot of tourists. I mean, and you got to think, like, I targeted tourists. Like, I want the easiest date. So my easiest date is going to be a Japanese tourist. They have the most money, they're the kindest, nicest men, and they're not going to be abusive. I would never date certain types of people. So I targeted the Japanese tourists.
From what you hear from the women who are coming to you for help, who are the majority of their clients?
It's a lot local. Yeah, and then like Tammy said, it depends on who they're looking for and where they're at. Yeah, similar statements to what Tammy said is what I typically hear.
There's two callers here. One says, most of us in the general public don't hang out near the strip clubs or Waikiki late at night. How do we help or refer sex traffic victims if we don't know where to look? And then the other person says, what do we do to help survivors get out? So I would
donate money to one of these organizations.
Thanks, Tracey.
No, I mean, the people who are working in this are far better apt to you than you are to come up with a solution. And if you're out trying to find workers on your own or trafficking victims on your own, you're probably kind of like that guy in the movie Taxi. Maybe you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, so if people do see a situation that they are concerned about, so one, mandatory reporting. If they think that somebody is a minor and they suspect that there's trafficking, then there's a child welfare hotline number that they need to call. I can't rattle it off the top of my head at this moment, but there's a child welfare hotline number in Hawaii that they
can go to your website.
They can call. They can also go to the Susanna Wesley website. They can look at the DHS website. You can find it. Just Google Hawaii, child welfare trafficking hotline. And then you can also Google the national hotline for human trafficking. And there's a national hotline. And so both of those actually direct down to local nonprofits to get help. If there's an urgent situation, they'll also suggest that calling 911 and everything like that. But you can call numbers and report in what it is that you're seeing, and whatever details it is that you have is really helpful, because that helps the service providers and the law enforcement be able to figure out who it was, what was the situation, and figure out how best to help.
Another thing about the situation is, there's a lot of controversy about the men who hire prostitutes. And, people who are concerned about, the women and maybe don't want to prosecute them, they're still really upset with the men. But in terms of witnessing sex trafficking or suspected sex trafficking, the people who are in the best position to do that are the people who hire prostitutes. Because they're going to go in there, and it's like, I hear some people say that all the men who hire prostitutes are these beasts who hate women, and it's like, well, that's not quite true. There are all sorts of guys. And a lot of people, including in the websites where the men post, you know, they're concerned. They don't want to date somebody who's a trafficking victim. I don't want to be involved in this. You know, this girl, I know her, and she blah, blah, blah. So, you know, we need to have some sort of, at least, a protection program. If you're a guy and you've went there and you saw a problem, you come forward to the police, you report it, we're not going to prosecute you.
What's the current status now?
Well, the current, obviously, if you see something wrong, call 911 and get that person help. I mean, obviously, I'm coming from the law enforcement perspective, so I'm always going to advocate that they reach out to 911. I think that's the most important, is that you have to reach out to somebody to get these victims help, whether they're minors, whether they're adults. If you suspect that something is wrong, then you need to reach out. And whether that's to law enforcement through 911 or through a service provider like Susanna Wesley or Tammy's organization, very important to make sure you reach out, because how else are you gonna help them? I think the important thing though is that, you know, trafficking is not very obvious to most people. And from a law enforcement perspective, what we see doesn't always present as trafficking up front. What we see is domestic violence. We see calls for, you know, he's beating her up. Oh, but that's my boyfriend. And so you have to dig a little deeper to find out what that relationship is. It often presents itself as an intimate partner relationship, domestic violence. And so it will move in a domestic violence you know, vein by way of investigation, and law enforcement and services may not be, you know, the same that you would get if it was trafficking. But oftentimes we are digging a little bit deeper and finding out, wow, that's really not her boyfriend. That is actually a trafficker. It could be a sex assault. It could be drugs, feeding drugs to a minor. I mean, that is also very common. So I think the important thing is that, you know, if you see something wrong, it doesn't necessarily have to present as trafficking. Just call.
Well, to her point, I wonder how much of HB and law enforcement in general is focused on, you know, the so-called Johns. Does law enforcement still do John stings?
Yes, that's my understanding, is that local law enforcement still has their John operations. They are still making efforts to address the demand. There are things that happen online, you know, whether that's electronic enticement cases. Those are being made by certain law enforcement agencies and being prosecuted. So yes, efforts are still being made to address John, or the demand part of it. Because there's so many sides to trafficking, right? You have the trafficker, you have the buyer, you have the worker. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on. And that's why we all try to work with each other, because it really takes a village to address this issue.
But I want to just clarify, the demand that you're addressing is a demand for prostitution. It's not a demand for sex trafficking.
Correct.
Because literally saying there's a demand for sex trafficking means the man is saying, I want to make sure the woman I'm hiring is being abused and forced into which there is no demand for that. There is a demand by some certain types of men for young girls, which is something different.
Or young boys.
Talking about. Yeah.
Young boys or young girls.
And actually, to that point, JD in Waikiki says tonight's focus is on women victims. What percentage or statistics is about men victims who are sex trafficked? How many clients of yours are?
We don't have, I mean, we do have some clients that are male and identify as straight. We do have some that identify as trans. So we have well, all of them. Certainly a majority of what we see is female, and I think that's what we see a lot across the country and across the world, is that we identify female victims. But there have been studies that have been done in New York City. There was a few. They're a few years old, but both of those studies were looking at the chances of there actually being more boys and more transgender than there is straight females that are being trafficked, that are being victims of sex trafficking. And there's some statistics out there that say 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, and we know that they can be trafficked by your typical pimps, but they can also be targeted by also pimps within the LGBTQ community. And so we have seen kids targeted through both of those sectors here in Hawaii.
Which is a new wrinkle, but I think that we need to be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about sex trafficking with adults and sex trafficking with minors, because there is a definition of sex trafficking, a federal definition that says anyone under 18 who's engaged in prostitution is, by definition, a sex trafficking victim.
Yeah.
Despite the fact they may have no adult trafficker in the picture at all, they're all, by definition, sex trafficking victims. So
Yeah,
that gets into a very confusing area. Because
It does in a way, but it's assuming that the adults that are purchasing the sex are complicit in the abuse of a minor, because they would rather, instead of connecting that minor to actual services that would be helpful, they would rather pay and have sex with them. And so it's looking at that. I would call it more like consumer-based trafficking, because you have consumers that are willing to exploit and take advantage of those minors rather than actually connect them to safe services.
I think that the problem that these minors have who are doing survival sex, which is what you're talking about, is what we call it. Their problem isn't the prostitution. The prostitution is generally what they see as the solution to their problem, and we're doing a bad job solving the original problem, which is why you're 16 years old and on the streets. That's where we're falling down.
Yeah.
And again, to them, the guy who gives them money and they give them sex, that's not their enemy. That's not the way they think. That's somebody who's helping them survive.
Well, and we do have a whole show dedicated to youth in this area.
Yes, we do.
Coming up in not next week, but the week after. Tammy, I want to circle back with you and ask you, what was it that finally helped you to pivot out of that system?
So, I mean, when we go back and look at my life, so at 4 years old, I was already being sexually abused at home. And so that led me into foster care, which I'm not saying that foster care makes anybody go into trafficking or be a traffic victim, but just for me, that's the trajectory of my life. It was, sexual abuse at home, foster care, got into prostitution as a minor, which I was being trafficked. And then as an adult, I just continued and didn't have, I guess I didn't have an identity of my own. Like I always wondered, like, where did I even come from? And I guess I'm born for this. And it was just bad relationship after bad relationship, TROs, and just bad. Like I never had the therapy or the recognition of, okay, your life is out of control and you need to do something about it. Until one of my friends, I had a very bad trick that kept stalking me on that last run. And she was just, Tammy, you're gonna die, or somebody's gonna kill you, or you're gonna kill somebody. Because I'm like being a firecracker, right? I'm like, I wanna kill this guy because he keeps stalking me and la 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 la. And then I okay, wait, he could come and kill me because he's stalking me. So my friend was just like, you need to do something. And I was like, what do I need to do? She's like, come to church with me. I'm like, what? With happy people? Like, don't really want to do that. Because how do they know what's going on with my life? And I did, I went to church with her, and then I was just like really quiet in the church and stuff. And then it was really sitting still for a couple of years in the church and then having an identity shift. Like just really forgiving people that hurt me, forgiving my dad. My dad got 2 20-year terms in Halava. He died in Halava prison. He's a pedophile. He had many victims, 30 plus victims in this state and around the country, not just this state. And so that, like having that forgiveness and then being able to just move on in my life is what helped me to just stop selling myself. I've been out of that lifestyle for 20 years now. I did not get into this anti-trafficking work because I wanted to forget that life. I wanted to forget about all that abuse that I suffered. I wanted to forget about all the times and all the families that I might have ruined because of what I was doing. And just, I really wanted to forget about that stuff. I just really wanted to just be, I'm a DV survivor, I'm a alcoholic that's not doing alcohol anymore, I'm in recovery, I'm a recovering drug addict. I just wanted to be that person. But like I said earlier in conversation, that when I saw that people didn't believe that local girls get trafficked is when I was like, no, I had a history of sex abuse that was unaddressed. I had a history of being trafficked that was unaddressed. I had a history of other things in my life that were not addressed. And there were not service providers like Susanna Wesley or Ho'olanapua in our community that was talking about sex trafficking, that was talking about force, fraud, coercion, that was talking about children or adults being forced to sell their bodies. We didn't have that when I was in that lifestyle. So for me, it's like, okay, well, it's necessary. It's necessary to talk about it today. So I'm really grateful that I can talk about it. I'm grateful that I'm alive. I feel like I cannot waste that stuff.
Veronica, tell me, when you hear her story, it's so compelling, it's so powerful. How does your organization and others like you reach women who are in that circumstance?
Oh, there's a lot of different ways in which we reach women. So sometimes it's they hear about it or they reach out for services directly themselves. They may have a friend that we helped, and that friend encourages them to call. A lot of times, though, we get referrals from law enforcement or from the medical community or from other nonprofits, other organizations that say, like, hey, something's going on, or I have a adult here, I have a kid here, like, I'm concerned about them. You know, I would like for you guys to talk to them, to reach out to them. You know, for the adults, they do have to be willing and wanting our services in order for us to be able to connect with them and to really help them. A lot of the children we get referred through because we are the contracted provider with child welfare for all suspected victims.
We have a woman who's writing in, as a waitress in Waikiki, I've witnessed many groups of people who appear to be victims of sex trafficking. I'd just like to encourage people to be aware, as this is clearly a problem we should try to stop. What is the best course of action in the moment? You know, if you're, as she is, a waitress, that person could only be in that restaurant for, 10, 20 minutes and then moving on. What is the best course of action?
I mean, I think the best course of action is to, if it's not something that rises to the level of calling 911, you just suspect something's happening, the more information that you can, you should call, but the more information you have, the better off we as the receivers of the information are. A lot of times we don't have a lot of information. The calls come in and, she has dark hair and she's wearing this clothes, and it can be very difficult to track that victim down. So the more information the caller can get or provide, the better off we all are. And I'm not saying that you should go up and start talking to them, and you have to be careful about what you do, but it would be helpful if you can give location and time and whatever it is that you can provide so that law enforcement or a service provider can do to reach out to that particular individual. That would be very, very helpful. And there are numbers to call. I don't have them off the top of my head either, but there are definitely numbers to call that can connect you. And I think that's the important part of what Vern is trying to say, the law enforcement side of it and the service provider side of it. I mean, we are essentially, hooked into each other now, which wasn't true in the past. And that has been very beneficial to us all. And to victims, we're all trying to be more victim-centered and informed about trauma that a victim goes through, like Tammy is describing her own trauma, and realizing that disclosure is a process. I mean, it's not going to come right away. It will take time for that victim to get there, and we just have to support them until they are ready to talk. And I think that's the most important. But we got to stay in touch with each other, and we got to work collaboratively.
I would add into that what the general public could do is also just see the person as a human being and recognize them. And, you know, it's a lot of times that survivors say, especially when they're in it, and Tracey was talking earlier, I think it was on the air, just about the shame issues that so many survivors, whether they were in it willingly or in it as a trafficked victim, so much that they carry, and that prevents them. I would say that's the #1 barrier to them being able to get help. And so just a respectful glance and a smile from a stranger can be something that builds a victim's hope, that builds their belief that maybe there is somebody out here who cares about me and will listen to me, and I will actually be able to get out of this, and I could live a square life. I could be out there with the rest of the community, and I'm not just, you know, seen as this outcast. So I think just being kind is really important, and it's something that all of the public can do. That they can do that, you know, whether they're waitressing, whether they're in a church, whether they're just walking down the street, you know, wherever it is that they are, is just being respectful and being kind. And treating people with that love and respect, that goes actually a very long way in building up their confidence and their courage to be able to reach out and ask for help.
Tracey, I can see you.
Well, I was just listening to this, and there's a lot of things that come to mind. And you know, there are also cases on the other side where people have, for example, there's a black man with a teenage black girl in the drugstore, and the police are alerted and come down, and it's his daughter. And I have a friend who is a black man also driving across Texas in a convertible with his white girlfriend, and they're held up for an hour and a half where they try to assume that this must be sex trafficking. So I think it's okay to be concerned and to look at things, but I think that we can also just assume, particularly when there are issues of race involved, that we shouldn't make that assumption. Sometimes people are together who are not of the same race for other reasons than someone's being sex trafficked.
I wonder how the internet has changed this situation. You know, when she's sharing her experience, she's walking down the street and she's out there very publicly, but I would imagine that the internet has really changed this industry.
It certainly has. I mean, and there are many schools of thought behind that as well. But there are not as many streetwalkers anymore because a lot of it happens online. And so it's so much easier now to get access to a John, a customer, and it's so much easier for a customer to have access to someone who is in the life because of the internet. Everything is online and you just never see it. You know, arrangements are being made, people are talking, and it's not just the internet. I mean, social media plays a big part in what we all see. Is it more prevalent with the younger kids? Sure, you know, because they're so much more savvy at it and they are online all the time. And so a lot of it happens that way. Has it made it safer? Some people say it's made it safer because they're no longer on the street. Has that prevented, you know, homicides from happening, sex assaults from occurring, abuses from happening? Absolutely not. I mean, the internet has not prevented any of that from occurring. And so these young girls and these women, or anybody who is involved in it, is still at risk of a lot of harm and a lot of abuses. And so the internet hasn't really stopped that from occurring
very
at
different,
all.
very different. And the girls who worked in the industry, they have different points of view about it. And for the transgender girls, one of the things that was liked about street work, which they hardly do anymore, was the concept of sisterhood. Because unlike the cisgendered women we're talking about, these girls there's no pimps involved. So all the girls out there are part of this whole community. And girls who are transitioning, or who are young particularly, who are coming from the high school where they're coming from a place where they're very unpopular because they're effeminate and whatever, and now they're out in a dress and they're on the street with all these older girls who are out in a dress and they're being prostitutes and they feel like they're real women. But the thing is, there's a networking. And one of the things that's consistently true in sex work is you're always safer when someone's got your back. When you're working with another girl, if somebody's taking down a license plate when you're getting in a car, if there's someone who warned you, or in the case of the trans women, there used to be people who'd come down and like throw bottles and stuff at them because they were, it was an anti-gay thing. And the girls would all get together and they would fight. And you'd have 20 local trans girls chasing your car down, that was something you didn't want to have happen, and you didn't go throwing stones again. But now that the girls are on the internet, the problem is you're more isolated. And some of the internet girls I've met who've come into SWAP, the girl who founded the SWAP chapter in Hawaii, Sex Workers Outreach Project, she came to a thing we did at the Capitol with a sex trafficking survivor who'd become a sex worker advocate. And so she's sitting there, we don't know who she is, but I said, what's this girl doing that? Then she identifies herself that she's working off the internet, and she says, my biggest problem is I'm lonely. I'm isolated. I can't talk to anybody about what I do. There's no one I can communicate with, I can't share with, I can't talk to. And so the isolation that can happen with the internet is a problem for a lot of women.
Tell us your perspective on that. How has the internet changed this? And as somebody who's trying to help these people, make a turn, how much harder is it to actually access these women?
It's definitely harder to access them, when you're separated by a computer and you don't know, who's really who and where they are. So it's changed tremendously, even in, the past decade, a little bit more that I've been doing this kind of work, right? I've just seen there's big shifts in who's on the streets, who's not on the streets, how many ads are online, whether or not Backpage is there or not. There's just a lot going on online. I mean, I can appreciate what Tracey is saying, and that there's a lack of camaraderie and sisterhood for some of the women. But I think that's interesting, not saying anything negative about that, because we're human beings and we need people around us. But that isolation is also a common tactic of pimps and traffickers, in that they want to isolate you.
Very different with cisgendered women with a pimp than it is with a transgendered girls. Very different.
Very different.
And in Waikiki during the 90s, you were part of your little family. You had your co-wives and you had your man, and there might be 2 or 3 co-wives. And the other girls, the other families, those were not people that you interacted with.
Well, I want to bring this comment in. I know we only have a few minutes left, but this is from an LGBTQ sex worker, and says many LGBTQ people turn to sex work to survive. Many of our clients become regulars. Assuming they're all abusive or targeting them for arrest brings harm to consensual sex workers, as well as those seeking our services. Please listen to sex workers when trying to help us. From law enforcement's perspective, I would imagine that it's difficult to include someone like this in the conversation, because your focus is enforcement.
Right, and you have to understand that. From a law enforcement perspective, our job is essentially to enforce whatever laws are out there.
Right. So how do you bring this person
Well,
in?
but the voice can be heard, at the ledge when they are creating these bills and when they are looking at the laws, like how Tracey had said. We should have this opportunity to review everything. Well, that's going to happen at the ledge, and that is a perfect forum for many people to come forward, because it's based on what the public is saying. A lot of it. A lot of it is political in nature, of course, but that is definitely a forum that is open to anybody who wants to voice their concern, and I think many people do. But that's where it has to.
It's true, because I've gone this past legislative session when the SWAP girls, there are 4 or 5 pretty young white girls who advertise on the internet, who are showing up, and they're talking about what their situation is and saying, I'm a sex worker. That changes the entire dynamic of the situation. Now, I know, from my work that most of the people I know who work in sex industry are not white, and they're not cisgendered women. They're, local girls, Hawaiian girls who are transgendered. And it would be nice if their voice was more heard. But it's, again, getting people to go over this barrier to say, I did this. This is who I am. Listen to me. Argue with me if you want, but please don't shut me out. And, it's a tough nut, because I personally think a lot of our statutes wouldn't pass constitutional muster if they were challenged.
Well, Tammy, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure that I include your voice in this. To someone who might be watching tonight, who might be in the situation that you were in, what would you tell them about life on the other side of this?
So I think it's a choice. It's always going to be a choice. So provided that, the choices that I had, what I looked at myself like, and where I was going in my life, I didn't feel that I had a lot of options. I'm not that educated. So for me, like going to college was not really an option for me. And so to get like a high paying job, and now mind you, I did get a very good job, and I worked 30 years as a bookkeeper in a law office, and I was able to sustain my lifestyle with my son to a certain degree, but there was always more that I wanted. You know, I was my materialistic, what I wanted, right? And so without having that further education, without having that option, coming out of foster care and not really having those, you know, options to go to college and to get a higher education and to get a high paying job, for me in my life, it was, okay, well, you have this ace of spade in your pocket, just keep using it, right? Until I had an identity change, until I no longer thought that my body could be used as a commodity, until I finally said to myself, and with a lot of support from others around me, that my body was more valuable than $1.
Thank you so much.
Cannot buy my body anymore.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. We thank all of you for being here. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, we thank our guests, Lynn Costales, Acting First Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for the City, Tracey Ryan, Executive Director of Harm Reduction Center, Veronica Lamb, Specialist with the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program at the Susanna Wesley Community Center, and Tammy Batanga, a sex trafficking survivor and advocate. Insights is off next week, but we will be back on September 19th to continue this conversation about sex trafficking in Hawaii, focusing on minors. Please join us then. I'm Yanji Denise for Insights on PBS Hawaii. A hui hou.